Good morning. I woke up this morning and after thinking about what all happened yesterday, there was something that I thought was important to acknowledge. Ever since September 21st of 2022, I have been without physical possession of my birth certificate and my driver's license, as well as my professional certifications and other very important documents. I want to bring your attention to something right here that I found in a book that I purchased regarding land use or land development law. I'm going to read this out loud. It says, as a context to this case, petitioners challenged the Court of Appeals' judgment by filing an application for writ of error with this court. Petitioners allege that the Court of Appeals erred by holding 1. That Section 26.177D of the Water Code is unconstitutional as a violation of separation of powers. 2. That the ordinance is not subject to Sections 212.002 and 212.003 of the Local Government Code. 3. That the ordinance is effective without the city first obtaining the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission's approval. 4. That the ordinance was a proper subject of the initiative and referendum process. And 5. That only Circle C's permit applications filed after September 1st, 1987 would be considered on the basis of the regulations and ordinances in effect at that time. Then it goes on to say, first let's consider where it says, and then it identifies the water code. Then it has another element where it says, in a quote, the trial court submitted several questions to the jury inquiring whether various provisions of the ordinance were unreasonable, arbitrary, or inefficient. Based on the jury's affirmative answers to these questions, the court then rendered judgment that the ordinance was invalid under Sections 26.177D. Then he goes on here, and in the course of this, he identifies different versions of the actual ordinance as they progressed through the legislature. And it talks about how that while they did not actually implement certain aspects of the ordinance upon consideration, it demonstrates the intent of the legislature to identify certain things as covered by the actual ordinance that ended up getting passed. Most of this case actually discusses the history of the new ordinance in the context of an older ordinance. Why is this important? Because in order for you to be able to evaluate it, right here for instance, where they're talking about the sections, and they're talking about the amendments, and they're talking about the Committee on Urban Affairs Bill Analysis, Texas HB 3187, 71st Legislator RS 1989. He talks specifically about how in the committee meeting they analyzed versions of the proposed ordinance to make distinctions about the intent. Well, in order for you to be able to know that, you have to have access to those committee reports. In order for you to be able to do that, you have to actually have access to the primary reference materials. That means you have to have the documentation of the consideration process the legislature went through in the course of determining whether or not to pass that piece of legislation. Now, in my original petition to the court, I said that the matter of documentation was essential and of the primary concern because refusal to provide appropriate documentation impeded my capacity to apply the appropriate process in order to be able to go through the court, and I contended the lawyers knew that. That members of the state bar, specifically lawyers specifically, knew that without the appropriate documentation that they would be able to get out of the claim. It just so happens this particular case was opined on by somebody who at the time was known as Justice Greg Abbott. He was a justice of the Supreme Court of Texas in 1998. You know, that would have been around the time I was just starting my career as an investigative journalist and managing editor of a newspaper in Chicago, Illinois. I am now going on more than 7 months without access to my birth certificate or my driver's license because it was allowed to be stolen as part of an unlawful proceeding. I'm letting you know, I have no intention of asking the Commonwealth of Virginia to provide me another birth certificate or the state of Texas to issue me another driver's license. I intend to obtain the original ones that I had stolen. I think that there are people that would appreciate that.